Hello Internet, in this video I will be covering the basics of how to use an airbrush for miniature painting. If you are a regular viewer of the channel, you may have noticed that the airbrush is making its way into more of my videos as of late. I've been using it more for a couple of reasons. The main one is speed. It allows me to speed up my painting process, which can really help when doing army painting. So, as I've been using it so much more, I thought I would make this video that will cover the basics of airbrushing and hopefully make it seem a little less scary. And make sure to watch to the end where I discuss the all-important blocking issues. I know for many, myself included, airbrushing can seem like a scary jump from how we traditionally paint our miniatures with a brush. I think it seems scary due to the fact that you are suddenly relying on a machine rather than your own senses when handling the brush. But this isn't necessarily true. Whilst we would usually be focusing on brush control and pressure with our fingers when using our trusty brushes, instead we are trading that for pressure on the airbrush trigger and distance from the model. You still have a lot of control over what is happening. Once you have had a couple goes at it, the scary feeling of lack of control disappears. And it is after all just another tool in our arsenal. It's as different to your fine detail brush as your dry brushes. It achieves something different and widens the possibilities of what you can achieve. There are a good handful of different types of airbrush on the market, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to focus on the gravity-fed kind, where the pot is on the top of the airbrush. This is due to the fact that it is the only one I have ever used or owned, so I can speak from experience, and it is easily the most common style of airbrush used in a miniature painting hobby. Throughout this video there will be various pieces of equipment used. All of it will be listed in the description below with Amazon links so that you can grab yourself what you need to start your airbrushing journey. So the way that gravity-fed airbrushes work is air is fed into the machine via a hose that's connected to the bottom of the airbrush. Pushing down on the trigger will allow the air to be released and blow out the end of the needle. When the trigger is pulled back, paint from the cup is allowed to join the stream of air and is therefore sprayed out of the tip of the needle. Pulling the trigger back further will allow a greater quantity of paint to enter the airstream, which means the more you pull it back, the more paint will come out. The hose on the bottom of the airbrush also connects to an air compressor, which is responsible for storing a bunch of air at a pressure level that you can normally adjust with a gauge that will allow you to blast through your airbrush rather than it leaking out like a sad fart. Aside from the paints, those three components are the bare minimum of what you need for airbrushing. Your air compressor does not need to be anything fancy. When looking for mine, I was very money conscious and bought one of the cheapest I could find, and it has served very well. Again, the hose doesn't need to be anything fancy either, and more often than not, the air compressor will probably just come with one. For the actual airbrush, I knew I didn't want to go for something dirt cheap that may not have that long a lifespan, but I also knew that I didn't want to go for something really expensive just to later find out I hate airbrushing and have wasted a bunch of money. So instead I settled on a good entry level model by Sparmax. Now when it comes to preparing your paints, you want them to be a little thinner than your average base coat, and according to all the experts, it should be the consistency of skimmed milk. But honestly, I always have an issue picturing skimmed milk when I'm sat at my painting desk, so I don't really go with that. For me, it has been a matter of trial and error. I have had lots of goes at mixing paints to various thicknesses. The way I now judge it is by mixing the paint and letting it run down the side of the pot. If it barely moves, it needs to be thinner. If it is flowing like water, then it needs to be a bit thicker. I would also like to point out that in terms of brands of paint, I use a variety and generally don't see a massive difference in how they behave in an airbrush. I've recently started mixing my paints in these little disposable shot glasses, rather than directly in the cup of the airbrush. The reason for this is, if any of the paint gets into the main chamber of the airbrush before I properly thinned it, then there is a chance it won't be able to pass through and you risk clogging up your airbrush. Doing it in these little shot glasses not only eliminates that risk, but it gives me more control overall. It's also worth noting that if you're just starting out and you can't afford flow improver, that is completely fine. Water will work, but flow improver will definitely be worth the investment as it thins the paint more effectively rather than starting to break it apart. Once you are happy with your paint, it is time to start spraying, and I would recommend you practice a little bit on a piece of paper. This will allow you to get a feel for the machine without potentially screwing up the model. Practice painting some lines at intentionally varying thicknesses, practice some squares and circles or whatever. Just play about and get used to the feel of the thing and how much pressure is needed when using it. Here's a little tip. Try to get into the habit of always returning the trigger to the front before taking your finger off. Doing this ensures that before you stop using the airbrush, a bunch of air is pushed through it, which will help to get rid of any paint that is resting inside, which will help prevent the paint drying in there and creating a blockage. When spraying on the paper, you may notice something known as spiderwebbing. This is something that we obviously do not want to happen on the surface of our miniatures. Now, there could be a few reasons for this happening. The most likely is that the paint is too thin and is therefore easily being moved about by the air once it is on the surface. The second reason is that you are simply airbrushing too close to the surface, so you're forcing a lot of paint into a condensed area so it has nowhere else to go. The other reason could be that your compressor is set to too high a PSI, which stands for pound force per square inch. I usually have mine set to between 20 and 40. I go for higher PSI when I want to get a large area covered quickly, like on terrain pieces, and then I lower the setting for soft highlights on models like Space Marine shoulders. So what do I believe the beginner should primarily be using their airbrush for? Whilst face paint is always a good option, even after owning mine for a while now, I tend to use it for a select few things, which I think is a great jumping off point if you're just getting into it. One of the most obvious things to use an airbrush for is priming. If Mother Nature has decided that using a spray can is something that you cannot do today due to the weather, then the airbrush offers a great alternative. I use the surface primers from Vallejo and they work just fine. Again, anything mentioned in this video is linked below if you want to grab yourself some of these primers. The thing that I use my airbrush for most of all is base coating the largest parts of models and then applying thin layers on top so that we can get a nice smooth transition to a highlight colour. For example, when painting my Great Unclean one, I sprayed the whole thing with a base coat of dark sea blue. Then spraying only from above, I started to use brighter colours until I was at a saturation I was happy with for the skin tone. I then polished off the skin by hand with a brush for very select highlights. When I started to spray the highlight layers, I made sure to only spray from above, as that ensures the paint isn't going in the recesses, which helps to keep the shadows where they should be, and it suggests volumes and shape that can take a lot more work when done by hand with a brush. This ability to create volumes can be really useful if you wanted to do some zenithal undercoating, which is where you usually spray your model black and then use white paint from above to start to suggest volumes. Then you can use washes and contrast paints to add the colours on top of the pre-made shadows and highlights. I've also started to use the airbrush more on the bases and miniatures to create smoother transitions in base tones that I can then dry brush over. The most common issue you will have with your airbrush is blockages. There are plenty of ways that you can minimise the frequency of which this happens. As previously mentioned, you can mix your paints outside the airbrush and you can make sure to return the trigger to the air only position before you stop painting. Another thing that can affect it is how you clean out your brush between paints. When switching between paints, I will rinse out the cup twice. Why don't I fill it with water and blast it through the airbrush to clean it? If I were to do this straight away, there is a risk that any dry particles of paint that are resting unnoticed on the side of the cup, or perhaps in the bristles of the brush, will be forced through the internal components of the airbrush and potentially block it from the inside. So instead, by rinsing it a couple times, I'm removing all the surface debris. Then I can add a small amount of water to the cup to pass through and rinse the inside of the needle. When I have finished my painting session, I do the same thing, but instead of running water through it at the end, I use airbrush cleaner. So what if you take these precautions and it still gets blocked? Well, then it's time to take the airbrush apart and do a deep clean. I recommend you do this every now and then anyway, just to maintain the machine's health. The first thing to do is turn off your air compressor and disconnect the hose from the airbrush, which will release a mini cyclone across your desk. All I use during this cleaning is 2 pieces of paper towel, some airbrush cleaner, and an old beaten paintbrush. One by one, I take out the components of the airbrush, making sure to lay them out on the paper towel in a way that makes it easy to remember what goes where. It can be scary doing this, but honestly it's not that difficult to put it back together. It just seems like it would be. Then I take each component that touches the paint at any point during the painting process and wipe it clean with some paper towel that has been dampened with airbrush cleaner. Be especially careful when handling the needle, as we do not want to risk bending the tip or anything. For particularly stubborn bits of thick paint, I use the paintbrush to scrub off the dried pigments, and occasionally I'll even use a toothpick on the nozzle area, if there is a thick layer there. Once I feel each piece has had a thorough clean, I reassemble the airbrush and test it out. So there we have it. Whilst there is plenty more we could talk about with the airbrush, I believe I have covered the basics that are necessary to get started, and hopefully I've made you feel a little less nervous about the prospect of airbrushing. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.